What even drives me more crazy
Mm.
are the ones who put it right next to the cart rack, but won't put it in the cart rack. And I don't confront people about it, but in my
You're not
mind,
like a
there is,
cart Karen?
yeah, I'm not accosting people because, in fact,
That would be awesome.
that, that's
I want
not,
to record that.
I bet you do.
Welcome back to another episode of Resisting Pretense. We're here to have honest conversations about a life of faith in modern culture. And we hope at the end of the episode, it'll equip you to have some of your own conversations and stir those up in you. And so I'm Tom Burks.
I'm Scott Little.
And we're going to jump into a conversation about, it really kind of ends up being about morality, I guess. But our entrance into that, I think, is going to be pet peeves because they're just fun to talk about.
It's like one of those icebreaker questions.
Yeah.
You know, you go into a group and say, "What is your pet peeve?"
Yeah, this is a good icebreaker question, and it's got an interesting tie to morality. So, what about you, Scott? What are your pet peeves?
You know, I think I used to have some that define my age, and so I'm not even going to talk about those because they're pretty much
lawn.
they're not existent anymore for the most part. I think magazines have gone to the wayside, and so my pet peeve has kind of gone away in that case. But I think one of my big pet peeves now in my life is seeing like when I go shopping to Sam's Club.
Mm-hmm.
I know people have been walking around for the last 45 minutes for an hour, picking up all their stuff, and they get it all the way to their car and they can't take their cart back to the cart rack. You know, it's like, and what even drives
that one extra minute,
that
just
one
too
extra
much.
minute to put it in there or to push in the next one. What even drives me more crazy are the ones who put it right next to the cart rack, but won't put it in the cart rack. It's like, come on, people, you've spent all this time. And you know, I always hear the argument, well, if I have children, I really don't want to push my cart back because I've got children in the car and I'm worried about that. And I'm like, okay, I can probably have a little grace there, but I'm pretty sure that the 500 carts that aren't in the cart rack belong to 500 people without, you know, and I see it all the time. I'm just like, and I'm that weird guy that goes into the cart rack and straightens them all out and pushes them all in.
Oh yeah, you are weird.
Because I want people to have room to push their carts into the cart rack. You know?
You're like the cart Nazi.
Oh, I am.
I love it.
I'm horrible about it. And I don't confront people about it. But in my mind,
You're not like
there
a cart
is
Karen.
Yeah, I'm not accosting people because, in fact,
That would be
that's
awesome.
that's
I want to record that.
I bet you do. But in my mind, there is this whole conversation about, I'm sorry that you walked an hour and a half around the store and can't get your lazy butt to walk the cart into a cart rack. You know, life is hard for you. I can tell, you know, just all these sarcasms that are coming out of me. So
that's hilarious.
It's kind of a scary thought of what,
You know, you just need to live a long time though, because it seems like all of your pet peeves are going to age out. Like, now, because now people are just showing up and Sam's Club delivers the order to your car, or if my daughter can't even be bothered with that, she just has Walmart bring the food to the house. You know? It's amazing. You know what? That's the thing about so interesting about COVID. Totally off topic, but how it accelerated certain kinds of change in our culture. Like in church life, it accelerated a whole bunch of change. We'd been talking for years about, you know, we've offered online giving years before COVID started, and we've always kind of toyed with do we stop passing the plate? I'm like, no, you know. And then COVID happened, and like instantaneously, we stopped passing the plate, and we never went back to it. And shopping, like people maybe had toyed with, you know, people ordered from Amazon and from other places. You can order from Walmart online before before COVID, but now that whole extra piece of how you get, whether you go in the store or whether they bring it out to you or they deliver it to your, like, that's such a different thing that happens so fast. Normally it takes years for businesses to kind of develop a new pattern of delivery, and that happens so fast. It was crazy.
Now, let me throw just an interesting thought that just crossed my mind as you were talking about that, because if you look back, and it was a little bit different, and technology has made it its own way, but you look back when in the supermarkets of like the 50s, there was always a bag boy that bagged your groceries for you. They put them in the cart. They pushed the cart out to your car for you.
Kind of come full circle.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. That's my point is, because of technology, we're back to kind of that same idea.
Kind of funny. I never thought about that.
So,
all right.
That's my pet peeve. What is yours?
Okay, I've got one. Well, I've got more than one, but the one that stands out to me as maybe like the most intense pet peeve. I cannot stand stopping on an interstate. It makes me like boiling angry inside, and it's weird because other than that one experience, I'm not an angry driver. Like people cut me off, and my wife's like, honk at them. I'm like, it's why bother? I don't, I'm sure they're having a terrible day. It's just like, so I'm not an angry driver, but
so city traffic doesn't bother you?
No, not at all. And traffic on the interstate doesn't bother me. But when you have a road that is designed with controlled on-ramps and exits, and other than like the bridge fell down, like there's no reason, because there's a wreck on the side of the road, there's no reason for traffic to be stopped on the road. And I just, like, I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to my brain. And I know there's probably, I've heard people talk about, well, it's the people changing lanes that then makes the person behind them brake, and then the person behind them has to brake, and it's a chain reaction. So, just stay in the lane that you're in. You'll get through it better. Changing lanes creates I don't care if I could be moving 5 miles an hour and I'm okay. But the moment I come to a full and complete stop on the interstate,
without any reason.
Well, I don't even care what, as long as there's a road ahead of me and they stopped. Why? My whole worldview was just destroyed.
I'm so glad you don't live in California on the major highways there, because they're
it drives me nuts. And me, I'm not generally an outwardly angry but I get anxious, and I'm rubbernecking around trying to figure out, and I'm trying to angle what lane is moving, and I'm the guy changing lanes all the time.
Considering driving in the alcoholics lane just so you can keep moving.
Whatever it it should not stop. It can go slower, but it should not stop.
I'm not sure that that's really a question of boundary or morality, though. I mean, unless you
it is in my mind.
Maybe the morality of how you're considering those other people in the midst of it, kind of like me and my shopping carts,
Yeah.
Because for me, and it's my standard. I know it's my standard, and I can't push that standard on anybody else.
But you sure would like to.
But I would like to. The right thing to do is to put your cart away. If you can walk around the store that long, you can put your cart away.
So that begs the question, what's the standard for, I'm doing air quotes on an audio podcast. What's
the YouTube people will love it.
Yeah. Okay. What's the standard for good?
Ooh, that's a good question.
And that's where this gets into a whole morality thing. Because a lot of times the pet peeves are things that we think people should do. Like, I know people with pet peeves of finding a can of corn in the supermarket in the chip aisle. Because somebody had a can of corn and they, oh, I don't need that. And yeah, I'm not going to go back 4 aisles and put it away. So I'll just set it down here. And some people were like, that's so wrong.
Is that obsessive compulsive? Maybe a little bit, like me in my shopping carts.
But, you know, pet peeves are these things that we just feel like people should do.
Right,
They're good. They're right.
right.
What's the stand like? But we clearly don't all have the same standards, or else we wouldn't have pet peeves.
Well, and I think we do set standards, but not based on our pet peeves. We set them on what we think is what might be considered morally right or wrong. The problem we run into is that there is, I think, a moral standard established by God,
Mm-hmm.
and then there is a moral standard established by law. And all of us are required to follow the law.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that when we follow the moral standards of God, there is a place where we say, well, we know where this comes from, and we know it's coming out of a place of love and out of a place of safe boundaries, versus the law is setting boundaries, but the law is setting boundaries because somebody else has dictated this is wrong for you, not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and the legal standard, I just don't think it goes far enough to be a substitute for like a comprehensive standard for good. The legal standard is only what makes us function as a society. And there's so many things not included in the legal standard. So like, for example, it's not illegal for me to lie to you. Do you like this shirt? Yeah, it's great. You know, that there's nothing illegal about that. Now, if me lying to you has a consequence that it has cost you something, then there's some possible legal ramification things like fraud and all that are essentially kind of the legal consequences of lying about something. But it can't cover all lies, and there are lies that have no consequence that are not illegal. And so I just don't think whether it's legal or not has a very small bearing on whether it's good or not.
Well, yeah, I think that, and it goes back to the whole idea of morality, is that, and I've heard you say this several times, that we can't legislate morality. And
Right.
that's where we get laws from. It's interesting. I was thinking about, as you were talking about your example of lies, is that it's not illegal for you to lie to me. It is illegal for you to lie in a court of law about me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are these lines that say, well,
You can lie some places and not others.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Where the moral
Don't lie in the wrong room.
where the moral standard is really, you don't lie.
Right.
That it's not a question of, it is morally wrong as a believer to lie to you, but legally it's not morally wrong for me to lie to you.
So it's kind of like legal standards are based on a moral code, but they are not the totality of they're a limited subset of a moral code. And then so how do you define, particularly, and this is hard for me because I don't have a frame of reference for not being a Christian. Like, I grew up in a Christian environment, Christian home. My morality has always been anchored in my faith and in the scripture. And so I don't know how somebody comes up with a comprehensive moral standard outside of a faith environment. Because the law's not enough, clearly. That's just a very limited subset. So how does somebody who has no faith, no, like anchoring document like the Bible, or anchoring principle like God's character or whatever it would be, how do those people decide what's right and wrong? I honestly don't know.
Well, but I think part of that comes into the idea of things being subjective and relative.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though I say it's wrong, somebody outside of the faith might say, well, that's fine for you because that's relative to you and that's your subjectivity. Where for a believer, we say our morality isn't subjective, it's objective. It's clearly laid out in the creator of what our morality is. And so somebody who has no reference to that level of objectivity and morality, they have nothing to base it off of. And so
Right.
they're looking around the world and they're going, well, this country believes this and I kind of like that. And so I think that's where I think that's where I will believe.
A
And
grab bag of morality.
well, and it truly is where our court system is gone, because when our court systems were originally set up, they were set up based on biblical values, based on the idea that there were judges of thousands and judges of
Mm-hmm.
hundreds and judges of 50s, and that those people would judge based on biblical law. When especially in our country, when the court system moved from being a biblical based law system to a precedent law system, it began to change things.
That's interesting.
And so when things started to say, well, the precedent has been set here in California, so that now has become the law because the precedent has been set, or set over here. In fact, there was a big case several years ago where they tried to bring in a precedent that was set in the Netherlands in a United States court system.
That's bizarre.
And it got thrown out because of that.
Yeah.
But when we look at our current system, it's like, well, this judgment was made back here, so that is now the precedent that we have to live by.
Yeah.
Versus,
But
we-
again, like legal systems are still such a small, like they're not going to cover how you handle your cart in the parking lot of the grocery store.
they should. Sorry.
They're not going to handle whether you put things back on the rack where you found them, or if they just land wherever you decided you didn't want it anymore. I mean,
Right.
there's so many things that the legal system is not even, but that are still all about our moral code. And honestly, I think I never really had thought about it until like during this conversation. I love that I have a code given to me.
Mm-hmm.
And we're so fiercely independent and contextual in our country, and we love our freedom and our and our ability to make our own choices, and I get that. But I also when I think about how would I arrive at a moral code that I could live by and that I could teach my children outside of like if I wasn't a follower of Jesus and that all meant nothing to me, like how would I figure out what I wanted to teach my children about stuff?
Mhm.
That's a little like that feels weird. That's uncomfortable for me, like because I want it to be anchored in something like not just random, not just arbitrary, like, well, this is how I feel about it, so this is what I'm going to teach you is right and wrong. That feels very like just based on my emotion or my perception or like what I ate for breakfast that day. That feels very arbitrary and not reliable.
Mhm.
And so I like that I have something that is clearly set and defined. And granted, it takes a lot of thoughtful engagement to kind of figure out how do I apply the Bible to today's moral landscape.
Mhm.
So it's not that it's just like, oh, I have a list of rules, but I have principles to live by. But I didn't have to create them, and I didn't have to decide that I'm the arbiter of this truth. Like it was given, and I like that. I feel comfortable about that. I never really thought about that before we got engaged in the conversation.
Well, yeah, and I think that so much of our legal moral code comes from our Christian moral
Mhm.
code, but people don't always understand that. So if you didn't grow up in the faith and your child said to you, well, why don't we murder? Well, because that's the law of the land. But if you asked a believer, they would say because the Creator created life, and it is not our place to take life. And in fact, He finds it offensive for somebody to take somebody else's life. And so there for
I'm
us.
laughing at the exact wrong moment. Sorry. That's on a rabbit trail in my head. I'll tell you it later. But go ahead.
But the point being is that we can look back and go, we know where and why the code came into place.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think somebody who has not had a upbringing like that would go, because that's just the law of the land. Well, where did that law of the land come from?
Right. So you're saying, Daddy, why don't we murder? And in my head, I'm thinking, well, your daddy's kind of a small guy. And there's probably, if we murdered somebody, there's probably somebody in their family that could easily take your dad out. So we just don't go there. Like, that's what I was thinking. So that's why I was laughing in the background about murder. Awesome.
Sounds like a sitcom
I know.
speech. You know?
So when it comes to Christian faith, there's an interesting relationship between morality and boundaries. Really, essentially, they're the same thing. The morality that the Christian faith espouses is just a set of boundaries that God gave. So, like, you stay in these boundaries, and we're good. It's not, at least the way that I look at Scripture. Some very like fundamentalist kind of Christians might say that it's a set of rules you have to follow. I think of it more as a set of boundaries you kind of stay within.
Exactly.
And they're more principle based. So, for example, like you, you value truth, and being honest is inside the boundary. Lying is outside the boundary. Now and I think valuing truth, it gives you a lot of kind of nuance to kind of say how do I most value truth in this situation, or you value authenticity, or you value caring for compassion. Well, what's the most compassionate thing I could do? There's not you can't have a list of rules long enough for this is how you do compassion in every single situation. Like, you need the principle of compassion, like loving others like you would love yourself. And then now you got to figure out, how do I apply that in this situation? Sometimes that may mean telling someone no. That is a hard no to make, because you kind of, like, I would love to help you, but I feel like helping you is enabling something in you that I think ultimately is not good for you. So I'm going to tell you no, even though it's a difficult or painful no. Or maybe somebody asks you for help, and you're like, yeah, you need help moving? Yeah, I'll help you. And you might have the same question from a different person. You need help moving? Like, every time you've asked for my help, it's always been 5 minutes after you needed it. Like, I'm going to say no this time, because I feel like your lack of planning ahead means you're always needing to be rescued. And so if you will give me 2 or 3 days notice, or a week's notice, whatever it is, like, I will be more than happy to help you. But right now, this is a crisis of your own making, and it's a pattern. So how we respond, I think, is nuanced to the situation and to how to best apply the principle in the situation that we're in. And I don't think that's situational ethics in the crassest sense of that. I've heard people say, well, situational ethics are nothing. I just think that's reality.
Well, and I think that oftentimes when we look at Scripture, and people say, oh, Christians don't have any fun. They have all these rules to follow. We always look at what we can't do, because that's the boundary. But we never look at the freedom that
so
comes
much
on the inside of that boundary. And the boundary is really not about pinning us in. It's about protecting us from either hurting ourselves physically, emotionally, or spiritually, or hurting somebody else in the process. And I think about, and there's a whole, I mean, you can take anything and look at it, but I'm going to use the one of, we really want good communication.
Mm-hmm.
My wife would love for me to communicate more with her. She would,
is that ever not true about a wife?
Well, but you know, the conversation often will be with a group of people, like I might be with, we might be with you and your wife, and
Hmm.
you'll say something and she'll look at me and go, "You didn't tell me that." And I'm like, "Yeah, you're right, I didn't." Because I don't always communicate well. Um,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
yeah, now you're lying. Now you're outside of the
Now we're outside the
boundary.
boundary. Dang it. Caught red-handed.
But we're we're designed to have good communication. We're designed to talk. We're designed to
Mm.
have those kinds of things. We're designed to tell the truth. But taking that outside of how God designed us for that, it becomes gossip. It becomes a hurtful, let me tell you about this person and what's going on in their lives. And, then it's like, I'm communicating with you, but in a hurtful, none of my
Hmm.
business kind of way, you know.
Yeah, and I think all of the boundaries that that God gives us can can be they kind of have a shadow side, or a dark side. Like you can say compassion is about, like, we should be compassionate, that's the boundary, but sometimes you can be so invested in compassion that it becomes permissive
Mm-hmm,
rather than constructive.
mm-hmm.
And so this internal desire to show compassion then becomes like, anything goes. I'm
Right.
a I'm going to condone anything you do. And there's all kinds of, I think, other side. You talked about, in our prep, you talked about self-care can easily denigrate into selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Interesting though is because when we talk about these things, that they always, at least everything within inside of God's boundaries, are always positive, and we look at them and go, but how could that be taken outside of God's boundaries and become bad?
mm,
And I think about generosity, because if I ever said to you,
it's hard to imagine being too generous,
yeah,
right?
exactly, it's difficult to see that, but sometimes we can be too generous, and that creates this wastefulness, that whatever we're being generous with is over the top, and then they don't use it, or they can't use it, or it's just sitting in a corner. Or and I even took it, as I was beginning to think about this, one of the problems that we run into oftentimes is the generosity of Americans, even in the church, to like the mission field, has created this dependence or
Mm,
this expectation from that country that now they don't do anything for themselves. And I remember my son and daughter coming back from a mission trip to Haiti,
that's exactly what I was thinking about. The same, because he told me the same story. Yeah.
that people would not go to eye doctors in their own country, or they wouldn't go to eye clinics in their own country because it would cost them something, because they knew eventually, even if it was a couple years later, the Americans were going to come, they were going to bring glasses with them, they were going to give them, they didn't have to do anything
Mm,
to receive this item. And so it's almost that feeling of um, and even in our own experiences in missions, we would have people who would say, these churches are going to come to you because they know you're Americans, and they know you're going to give them stuff. So they're going to be asking for the world. You need to be
right.
careful about how generous you are, because it takes their responsibility out of taking care of themselves.
Without purposefulness, any of these can be, you know, can denigrate into that kind of shadow side.
Absolutely.
Um, our caring, still, we can care, but we also need to care purposefully. We can be generous, but it needs to be purposeful. We can communicate, it needs to be purposeful. There, when we do these things without a sense of purpose, then I think that's when it just kind of it gets loose, and it no longer has the same constructive value. Um, yeah, it was interesting. There's positive boundaries and there's negative. Like, there's the positive boundaries of do this, do, like, not this specific, like, but like, aspire to be kind, aspire to be good, aspire, those are positive positive boundaries, and there's negative boundaries like don't lie, don't cheat, don't, 10 commandments are all generally negative boundaries. And the I don't know, I lean toward the aspiration kind of positive boundaries. But it's interesting. I find that in different situations, um, the positive or negative, the way they're expressed, positive or negative boundaries, can be helpful in different ways. It's funny, the negative boundaries actually, in a lot of ways, create a great sense of freedom. Like if I know I can't do these 12 things, then I can do anything else. And it's great organizationally, I think. Like, I went through this training for how to work with a board of directors. And they were like, you need to create a list of boundary statements for the executive of the organization of the things they can't do. And they are the only things they can't do. Like they can't choose to have the company do something that is illegal. They can't overspend what is in their discretionary amount to spend. They can't, hire like at this particular level of the organization without approval. And it was just like this list, and then outside of those, however many statements that were the boundaries for the executive, it's like, other than that, you run the company, and the board provides oversight, and the only times they can truly correct you is when
You've done something bad.
when you've done something outside of those boundaries. And sometimes you learn about a new boundary, like, oh, we probably should have a boundary there. We got bit in the butt with that one. But then there's a huge sense of freedom because I know exactly where I can't step, but anywhere else I can step, I can do with a sense of like, this is safe, this is good. So I think, particularly organizationally, when you're trying to create a rule, negative boundaries are most helpful. But I think when you're trying to inspire someone personally, I like the positive boundaries better. Like, when my kid walks out the door, I'm like, be good or be kind or make somebody's day today.
Right.
And those are things to aspire to that I think, when you walk out the door, it's like, don't cheat on your test today. Like that's not redemptive. It's not.
Well, unless it's the fifth time you caught him
Right.
cheating on his test. But the other thing is that, and as you were talking, I was thinking about this because I think there are the negative boundaries say almost give us the hard line of this is when you've crossed
Mm-hmm.
over. But when we find that we've crossed over, there is a way to step back using positive boundaries. And the one that came to my mind was that sometimes if we need to deal with either like selfishness or greed, the antidote to that is generosity, is learning to be generous because that takes us out of I want, and going,
Yeah.
wow, look what this did for someone else, and the boundaries, good or bad, are always pointing us back to the Savior.
Mm.
They're always taking us back to say, this is how I am. Be like me.
And that's huge to me. Like, ultimately, the Christian standard of morality isn't even the Bible. Like, we see it in the Bible, but what it is, the Christian standard of morality is God's character. And whatever these the negative boundaries are, they're like, this is clearly outside of God's boundary. But when you talk about positive boundaries, like, um, be holy because I am holy, or, love your neighbor as yourself, or, you know, give abundantly, or generosity or gratitude, those positive values are almost like signs that lead you into like deeper into God's character. And ultimately, when we're reflecting the character of God, we're going to be making good decisions that are purposeful, that are, that defy kind of having a list of rights and wrongs. Now it's just about care. And I think God's far more concerned about our character than anything else.
Well, and I think that that's, as we say, this is God's character, and I want to be in God's character, it moves me away from that negative boundary. If God's character is generosity and I lean into generosity, I'm going to move away from greed and from
Right.
selfishness. And so, it's almost like giving me more freedom in going towards Jesus than giving up my freedom going away from Jesus.
It makes it just, I'd love to get into some conversations just out in life with people that aren't Christians and try to dig into like how are you making these, what are you basing it off of? What's the anchor, or is it just truly just arbitrary? Like, is it just like whatever seems culturally appropriate or relevant at the time? It's interesting. I'd be very curious to find someone. So much of my circle is Christian people. I think it'd be a really valuable conversation to get into. Just find out what's driving this and everyone else. So to wrap it up, I have a kind of a question for you. Just thought it would be entertaining. Uh, what boundaries do you like being tight in? Like it feels safer and better and good to have tight boundaries. And what boundaries do you kind of wish weren't there?
I think that's a hard question. It's probably easier for me to say that I wish there wasn't a boundary like on debauchery. I because I mean, we really spend truly one day in debauchery.
Scott's a secret pirate. He's a closet pirate.
Thanksgiving, where we just like, oh, let me eat and drink, and oh, this is great, and just keep bringing on the food. That and Super Bowl Sunday, I think,
Right,
those two are kind of the, but the rest of the time you're like going, I need to really be kind of nice, So I think there's just things that I would love to indulge in that I don't, because I know that's really not what Christ's heart is. But my inner self is going, ooh, that would be fun to just dive into that and go crazy, whatever that is. So I think that would those calorie things, I don't know. But I think that would be the one to loosen up on. The one that I like having a tightness, I think, around is really about intimacy within relationships. And that includes, I mean, not just physical intimacy. So I think there's boundaries with my wife that says, you don't take this beyond your wife, because that goes into, promiscuity and a variety of things that are hurtful. And so I think, it's always a boundary that I is always looming, but it wouldn't be looming if it wasn't there. And so I'm glad that it's there, because it keeps me tied in. But even intimacy emotionally with people develops a trust and a level of communication and a gentleness and a grace and a forgiveness. And I like that. I like that level of saying intimacy is good. Don't take it outside of it. So I like the tightness of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We hadn't discussed it before we started recording, but I think mine are about the same in general terms, like the boundaries around what healthy relationships look like and what you have to do to foster and protect those are like, they feel really good being tight, like being very clearly defined and not a lot of wiggle room in them because of the potential for hurt. It's funny for me. I'll just come out and say it because my wife doesn't listen to this podcast. Um, I think, when you said debauchery, I was thinking a little wider than chocolate pie. Uh, the, the
Now, wait a minute. Now I'm curious about your definition of debauchery.
well, I was thinking about all the passions of life. Like, there's the shadow side of me that wants no boundaries for anything and wants, to for there to be, um, eat whatever you want, do whatever you want, sleep with whoever you want. I mean, all, just no boundaries at all. And there's one side of me that, like, that's that, like,
That's
cast
enticing. Yeah.
that, that just feels like, that would be so much easier. Um, and so it's really the same thing, like the same thing that I appreciate about tight boundaries and intimacy in relationships is what the other side of me is fighting. And it's because I know if I indulged all the passions of life, there would be a train wreck of hurt and pain because it would not be intimacy, it would be selfishness.
Right.
It wouldn't have merit and meaning and depth. It would just be me indulging every selfish thing I wanted, and it wouldn't be good. And so the boundaries that God gave us that are particularly relational ones, I do find um, very valuable, even though they fight sometimes with those things inside of us that just want our own way all the time. So,
Right.
yeah.
When we begin planning this, I'm gonna come back to something you said in the initial planning
Mm.
of this podcast, which I thought was fascinating, and I thought that's I like what you had to say about it, and I'm gonna probably do a very poor job of
I doubt that.
re-expressing what you said, but
Just say it and I'll fix it.
it was to the idea of one of the boundaries that I wish was held tighter. You said, that I think is too loose and should be held tighter in our society is definitions. It's the
Oh, yeah.
definitions of you know, and I think it was in the idea of gender was the idea that let's define these because we've made them so loose that they're
Mm-hmm.
confusing. And I don't know if you remember that conversation.
A bit, yeah. I think we, when we keep changing what words mean, then we get into conversations where you're using the same words I am, but we're using them with different meanings, and I don't think it's helpful. Um, I think the context of the conversation we were having was about marriage, like whether traditional marriage and gay marriage, and I just frankly wish that we would call them something different. I understand in our society, not everyone's a follower of Jesus, and you know, gay and lesbian people have relationships that they want to be committed to each other and have the same, tax benefits as a traditionally married couple. And I get that. Like but I wish they would call it something different because it is something different. I mean, it's a different kind of relationship. Um, and I feel like it muddies the waters when we use language inarticulately. And I understand some of the reasons why they don't want different language. Um, but I think you can also celebrate, we have this thing that it's ours and we call it this. Great. And we have our thing and we celebrate and we call it this. And that's fine. But I think it's when we get into competing with each other. And it does get back to morality because I want to call my thing that's different what you call yours so that it falls in the category of what you would call good. And we can't tweak language to affect morality. Morality is based in God's character, not in language, at least for the Christian. And so I just think we're having sometimes silly conversations about things rather than meaningful conversations because we're willing to even frankly create new words or new categories so that we could have meaningful conversations. But yeah, I would love to see Christians engaging more with their friends about like, how do you decide, how do you decide what to tell your kids about this? And just find out, like, because I know how I'm going to decide how I'm going to tell my kid. And I just, these are the conversations that we could have with people that introduce faith into the conversation without being let me tell you how wrong you are. Well, like, I want to understand what what you think and how you process. And then often the natural response is, well, I don't know. I guess I do this and this. What do you do?
Right.
And then, this is wide open door to say, for me, it's all about, how I understand God's character and try to model that as best as I can in our setting. Because there's something consistent there. And I think our culture goes all over the map.
Well, and I think there's always different kinds of conversations that you can even step into that, even whether it's talking about politics or talking about world issues or whatever. A simple way to step into that is just like you said. So tell me how you came to this decision.
Mm-hmm.
What is the backtracking to how you morally decided this was right or this was wrong? I'm just curious to know that thought process.
Yeah, so I guess the challenge to our listeners would be, one, is your sense of morality grounded in cultural trends or in God's character? And then two, have you seen it as an open door to engage in conversation with people that brings in the faith into the conversation, not in an accusatory way, but just in a dialogue? And I think that's another way for us to engage our culture with faith.
Love it.
All right. Well, we are still, sadly, unofficially sponsored by Diet Coke. And I haven't finished my Diet Coke yet this round, but usually it's gone before the end. But
well, we've been talking a lot.
We haven't. That'd be funny if we just didn't talk at all while we were drinking. But yeah, so still unofficially sponsored by Diet Coke. Can we call that sponsored? Yes. We call it whatever we want if it's unofficial.
Well, yeah. Somebody's paying for it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it was me today.
But it's not. I can't say it's unofficially
That's
sponsored by Tom Burks because
there we go.
It's unofficially sponsored by.
Officially sponsored.
It's officially. What's
right.
the boundary?
That's right. We'll see you next time.
Bye.